Welcome to Uncertain Things. Once again, I'm here without Vanessa, who is still finding her new schedule with her little creature that she has conceived. For today, I am honored to be joined again by Ahmed Fouad Alkhatib, who is a resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, where he's also the director of Realign for Palestine. I had the pleasure of talking with Ahmed previously on the Dispatch podcast, and I thought this has been a good chance to review how things have changed over the past year since we spoke. I'm going to touch that a little bit, but if you want to go back and hear more of Ahmed's backstory, we're going to touch that a little bit today, but if you want to hear more of Ahmed's backstory and how he came to his views, please check the links to hear that episode. Today, we are obviously going to focus a little more about recent events, both in Iran and in Gaza. But before we get started, Ahmed, thank you for joining me again.
Delighted to be here. Thanks for having me. And I wish it were under better circumstances.
I think maybe just to give people a little more content to your bio, and both professional and personal, give listeners who haven't heard our first conversation a bit of your background, and maybe even lead us to the point of you launching the Realign for Palestine, which I don't think existed last time we spoke.
Certainly. So actually, there's something timely about my bio because I had just shared a post on my socials. Exactly 18 years ago to the day is when I both had my interview for political asylum here in the United States. I was 17 at the time. I'm 35 right now. And it was when Hamas violently took over the Gaza Strip, starting the series of events that led us to where we're at today. And so my name is Ahmed. I grew up on and off in the Gaza Strip and then lived in the Gaza Strip until I was at the age of 15 and came to the United States as an exchange student for a year, high school exchange student. Attempted to go back to the Gaza Strip, but was unable to. I was stuck in Egypt because Hamas abducted an Israeli soldier on the Israeli side of the border. I must state, I left 1 month before the withdrawal of Israeli settlements in 2005. And so when I couldn't go back to Gaza, also Hamas had risen to power. And there was just a lot of suspicion about the program that I had participated in. I returned to the United States, applied for asylum, and I became a citizen of the United States 11 years ago. I worked in nonprofits. I worked in NGOs. I have a degree in business admin and a master's in intelligence studies and national security. I was thrust into the scene on October 7th because most of my immediate and extended family remained in the Gaza Strip. I was really horrified by what was unfolding, both in terms of the attack itself, the implications, the taking of women and children in Israel as hostages, and the normalization of that discourse as somehow being justified under the banner of resistance. I was also horrified by the dehumanization of the Palestinian people. I was horrified by the destruction of the Gaza Strip, the normalization of violence against all Palestinians, and as being somehow justified retribution. And I put myself out there trying to operate outside the traditional binary pro-Palestine or pro-Israel narratives, and trying to hold space for multiple truths and really connect with people across the aisle. But especially I wanted to build lasting alliances with Jewish Israelis and the Jewish community across the political spectrum, not just leftists, certainly not just anti-Zionists, but even self-identifying Zionists, liberal Zionists, center-right, center-left folks, and even some on the right. And so, yeah, and that ultimately led to me meeting and encountering other Palestinians and Arabs and Muslims who felt unrepresented by the current discourse, who felt that our narrative has been hijacked by extremists, both Palestinian, Arab, and Muslim extremists, but especially also by a lot of allies and non-Palestinian voices who were speaking over the Palestinian people, who were acting as if in the name of intersectionality, their voices are just as relevant, and that, it reeked of really problematic rhetoric. And so that's where the idea of Realign for Palestine came about. And the Atlantic Council was merely a vehicle for incubating it. I started at the Atlantic Council as a resident senior fellow, doing kind of to house a lot of my efforts. But my goal was to try to build infrastructure around myself that I can use to plug in other folks, particularly in the Palestinian community and the Arab and Muslim community, as a secondary target audience. And that's been, a challenge in some regard, a success in others. There are many like-minded folks in that I encounter, but it's hard to speak out. It's hard to speak up and out. We have a lot of challenges in our community. We have a lot of self-censorship. We have a lot of enforced cohesion, enforced conformity. We have a lot of, it's very easy to be called a spy, a traitor, a Zionist, a sellout. How much are they paying you? Anything you seek to challenge in the pro-Palestine narrative, you will find a lot of opposition, even though what sustains me are a lot of quiet voices who privately and regularly reach out to me and tell me how much they appreciate the fact that someone else is saying it. Someone else is saying what they know is true, but they can't say so publicly. And those are the people that I genuinely care about the most, much more than the fools who are still believing in Hamas and the resistance narrative. And so that's where I'm at.
And you were directly impacted by the war in Gaza.
Certainly. Part of what propelled me into the scene, if you will, was and I want to be clear that you'd be pressed to meet any Gazan who hasn't lost a family member, hasn't lost their home. But I experienced a really horrific loss of dozens of my family members, the destruction of my 2 childhood homes, and just a month ago, a dear first cousin of mine, my mom's nephew, who worked, who was an officer for the International Committee of the Red Cross in Gaza, was killed. Somebody that I grew up with, somebody who was 3 years younger than myself, somebody who works with the international humanitarian community. And so that increased the number. And in late September, there was another loss. And then in early January, before the ceasefire, my cousin Muhammad, who's my dad's nephew, was also killed. So it brought up the number now to 35, unfortunately. But yes, it was immediate and extended family members, my brother and his wife and 4 children. My brother, who's still in Gaza, they were in our house when it was bombed and hit, and they pushed their way through the rubble and survived. And I got his wife and 4 kids out. But so that is a sense of skin in the game, a sense of connection to this, and a sense of desperation to really not see this loss go in vain and have it become something that it promotes revenge and retribution and hate and incitement, and to really break out of the cyclical and vicious cycle that entraps both Palestinians and Israelis, but also to say vehemently how much I'm in opposition to Hamas as the evil terrorist regime that triggered this war, that started this war. And yes, this did start on October 7th, even though a lot of smartasses will try to tell you, oh, this didn't start on October 7th. Well, no, Shiza. Of course, we know this has been going on for decades, but this chapter, this deadly destructive chapter, arguably the most destructive chapter in the Palestinian people's history, even numerically and quantitatively and qualitatively, I would argue in some regards, even just as destructive or even more so than the Nakba in 1948. 2.1 million Palestinians in Gaza have been displaced, when in the Nakba in 1948, you had something like 700,000 who had been displaced. So that's where I am furious at Hamas, but I'm also furious at Netanyahu and the Israeli government and what's going on both currently with the prolonging of this war and the unspoken alliance with, or not even alliance, the using of Hamas as part of a 3D chess, and that to keep the Palestinians divided and to have them be indirectly supported by Qatari and Iranian money. So
in that last point, you're referencing Netanyahu's triangulation before the war. His vision of managing the conflict was relying on the Palestinian Authority run by the PLO and Fatah in the West Bank being divided and directly in opposition to Hamas in Gaza. Hamas in Gaza, for people who don't have the background or have not listened to previous podcasts where we discussed that history, Hamas in Gaza has extirpated the PLO from Gaza once it took over in a very swift civil war. And with the PLO being purged, it has consolidated entirely in the West Bank and remained in fear of such Hamas takeover happening also in the West Bank. So Israel was able to play, especially under Netanyahu, very intentionally, that mutual threat as a way to diffuse both of them as a threat to Israel.
Precisely. But also, I would argue even more than just a threat to Israel, to weaken the chances of a two-state solution and to proclaim that there is no viable Palestinian partner to negotiate a peace treaty with, or that there's no cohesive Palestinian partner, and the existence of a vile terrorist organization sworn to Israel's destruction that was smuggling weapons from Sinai, that was building tunnels, that was building rockets and shooting rockets into Israel. And this was even before the existence of the Iron Dome, the defensive system, was so menacing and horrendous that Netanyahu and some elements within Israel thought that there could be a utilitarian value in managing this terror threat, mowing the lawn, as they were calling it. Every few years, you go in there, you clip Hamas's wings, and then you let the Qataris come in, they rebuild, they give Hamas money, you let the NGOs. I worked with a lot of the NGOs, I appreciate them, but the NGO industrial complex and UNRWA and the UN ultimately were part of this. Even if they're well-intentioned, they indirectly enabled Hamas to stay in power, because Hamas was able to say, we can't take care of our people. Let NGOs, let UNRWA, let everybody take care of the Gazans.
Hamas openly multiple times actually said, when it was accused of not taking care of basic welfare and civic infrastructure in Gaza, that was not its concern, that is UNRWA's responsibility, while Hamas was involving itself in digging tunnels and developing military capacity or terrorist capacity to cause harm to Israeli civilians. Hamas saw the resistance both in the political sense and in the more theological, eschatological sense as its primary goal, where the welfare of Gazans was outsourced to international NGOs.
Precisely that. And so turning 70% of Gazans into aid-dependent subjects, even as Hamas got billions of dollars from the Qataris, from the Islamic Republic of Iran, and from all sorts of other networks in Turkey, in Malaysia, in Indonesia, some of the Arab countries, some of the folks, the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, in Kuwait, in Algeria. I mean, Hamas had networks that bypassed the blockade. The Hamas imposed taxes. Hamas used smuggling. Hamas did everything to sustain itself, its government, and its movement at the expense of Gazans who were, again, kind of taken care of by the Palestinian Authority, still actually sent in money, etc. My point being is that, unfortunately, where we're at right now, and I'm harping on this point because it was exactly June 14th, 2007, 18 years ago to the day. Like, and it's ironic that I was the first Palestinian to receive asylum in the United States because of Hamas's control. My interview for asylum was that very day in San Francisco, California. So my lived experience in the United States is intertwined with what unfolded in Gaza, with what happened. And that's why people don't understand why I'm so ferociously against Hamas. And I genuinely view them as an existential threat to the Palestinian people, even though, of course, as my detractors always will attack me. You're a traitor. You're a shill for Israel. You support Netanyahu. I mean, ridiculous stuff, right? Because I've been ferociously critical, historically and contemporarily, of Israeli policies. But I also, going back to the work of Realign for Palestine, one of the things that I'm trying to do is to actually redefine what it means to be pro-Palestine, to redefine what it means to be critical of Israeli policies and actions. But where do you draw the line of what is being critical of Israeli policies and actions, which I think I am against the military occupation, but even just words like what's occupation? And I use military occupation because occupation means different things to different people.
You're already bringing so many layers that I want to disentangle in the conversation. You're saying occupation. My brain already goes to this recurring stupid debate about does Israel occupy? Of course, Israel occupy. What Israel is doing in the West Bank is definitionally an occupation. That is not a moral statement. That is a description
of Israel's own law. Israel's Supreme Court calls it an occupation.
The way that this is being played, both by pro-Israelis and anti-Israelis, is as if this is a moral conversation. It is not a moral conversation. You can argue whether or not the occupation is just. You can argue that the occupation has gone too long. You can argue that the occupation is cruel and needs to be abolished. But it is an occupation, and it is a result of legal international developments that have led to that state. An occupation is the result of a war and an annexed territory, which remained under military rule. Theoretically, an occupation needs to be resolved within reasonable time and either claimed sovereignty and brought into the fold of the occupying country or returned to the country from which it was taken. With the West Bank specifically, this is a uniquely problematic issue because there was no clear sovereign beforehand, because from Ottoman rule to the British Mandate and to the brief control of the Jordanian government, there was no clear internationally legal entity that lays claim to it. The Palestinian people see that as their rightful homeland, which brings us to where we are now. But in terms of the legal category, the legal history of what it means to be an occupation, it is just a fact. And the discussion about Israel is occupying and then mingling phrases like apartheid into the mix is muddying the water in a way that makes it more difficult for Palestinians to achieve self-determination.
And that's, again, precisely why I believe being precise with language, being careful to avoid sloganeering, being very targeted in specific aims and goals. At this point, calling the entirety of Israel as a form of occupation is ridiculous because it is an existing, it's akin to saying the United States is entirety an occupation. Israel exists. The Jewish people are here. There is Jewish heritage to the land and a connection. There's tiers of it to where this is not forward-looking and not helpful. Whether you want to go historic, whether you want to go moral, whether you want to be pragmatic, which is my thing, is pragmatism. My slogan is radical pragmatism. It's not even a slogan, I should correct. I should say my principle is a rejection of violence, radical pragmatism.
Your operating system.
Precisely.
I allowed myself to get dragged down the occupation discussion. I actually didn't want to go there. I wanted to take a step back and look at first principles. Not exactly first principles, but to take a few steps back to make the conversation more productive and level set a little bit. I think we both share an intuitive understanding, both of us having grown up in the region, about what kind of world we want to live in, what are the threats to our vision of a homeland, a Middle East looks like. And I think that even that vision is not clear. The difference between the vision that we intuitively share and is intimated in some of the ways that we're discussing these things, even in points that we might disagree about politically, we seem to be sharing a basic language that we recognize in each other. And that's why we feel like we can have this conversation. But that doesn't necessarily translate to many Western ears on one hand and many more zealous, fanatical ears in the region. So I think clarifying what kind of world we are even trying to realize is important, because it is not as trivial as it sounds. It is not the Westerners' view of everybody should just live together, or, you know, if once you decolonize the region and disrupt this foreign Zionist entity, everything will the dams will break and nature will flow, and all of the beautiful indigenous natives will just dance together in joy. We have a very different view of what it means to survive in the Middle East. And I think it starts with a 19th century understanding of self-determination, right?
I try very hard not to go that. I mean, believe me, I speak about the historical context in which Zionism and the idea of nation state emerged. But what I envision is that I call it the two-nation solution. And it's basically an expansive way of saying the two-state solution. The two-state solution is a very prescriptive, specific, like, here's the exact borderlines, here are the exact specific issues. And some of those might be viable based on the old framework of Oslo from 30 years ago. Some of them are clearly not. But what I'm trying to stick with is the reality of the fact that there is not going to be this utopic one-state solution, one-state reality. There is not going to be the sanctioning or boycotting Israel out of existence per the South Africa model. There is not going to be this academic fraudulent view that somehow you're going to decolonize Palestine and somehow that will result in those who want to go back to Europe and Poland can go back to Europe. Those who want to live and stay there under the banner of the indigenous rule will stay. Like, really, really cuckoo theories for how somehow Palestinian self-rule, as envisioned by through the prism of decolonization, is going to produce this highly successful, just model for the two people, for the Jewish people and the Palestinian people, to coexist and live as they did before Zionism came around in 1948. What I'm saying is that I am tired of the Palestinian people being part of this experiment. I am tired of 77 years of us basically, I mean, our history isn't even told. A lot of our Palestinian early history, the history of Nakba, a lot of it was actually told by Israeli historians. A lot of Palestinian nationalism was informed by other Arabs and the pan-Arabism of Nasser in the 50s is really, which is ironic because it was happening at a time when Jordan, which administered the West Bank, and Egypt, which administered Gaza, why wasn't a provisional Palestinian state established between 1948 and 1967? Why were they early on arresting Palestinian nationalists who wanted to establish a Palestinian government and base it in East Jerusalem, which was under Arab control? Why is it only that 1964, when the Arab League Summit took place in Cairo, that the PLO was formally established, the Palestinian Liberation Organization? In other words, what the tragedy of the Palestinian history, the Palestinian people, is that historically or even contemporarily right now with the one state, you'll never walk around in Palestine, in Gaza, or in the West Bank and hear a Palestinian talk about, I want a one state solution. I want to be a part of Israel. Every Palestinian in the land that I know, and most of them, and those who haven't been brought on endless tours to Ivy Leagues and Western universities, will tell you, no, we want a Palestinian national state for the Palestinian people, just like Jewish Israelis want a space for a Jewish majority nation. So two distinct, separate spaces in which two separate people can express their unique national identities. That is what I am in, at a time when the two-state solution is so unpopular because it has been vilified, and you have all these 12-year-olds coming into activism, coming of age, coming into college campuses, or some of these fossils, these academics types, kind of saying this theory like, oh, well, we tried the two-state solution and it didn't work. Excuse me, guys, why did it not work? I absolutely believe that there were elements within Israel who were inciting against it, and Netanyahu and Hamas and whatever. But within the imbalance of power dynamics, let's actually I genuinely believe there exists plenty of space for Palestinian agency, accountability, responsibility. And that's not blaming the victims. That's actually the first step to empowering the Palestinian people, such that what happened in the 1990s during the negotiations between Arafat and Yitzhak Rabin, Hamas was doing suicide bombings and inciting against the Palestinian Authority and receiving this is totally documented, direct instructions from the Islamic Republic of Iran. That's why there's never going to be a Palestinian state as long as the Islamic Republic of Iran exists in its current shape and form. As Netanyahu and his ilk were inciting inside of Israel against the peace process, etc. But again, I'm speaking about it from a Palestinian lens. Why wasn't there an open Palestinian discussion internally to say Arafat about why Arafat rejected the 2000 Camp David Accords? And then decided to launch the second intifada? Why hasn't there been a true accounting for, if it did happen, why Abu Mazen didn't go for the 2008 Ulmer plan? Finally, I'll give you the granddaddy of them all, and we're coming up on the 20th anniversary of that this August. We're coming up on the 20th anniversary of the withdrawal of Israeli settlements in Gaza. Now and I was in Gaza when that decision was happening and the lead up to it, and Ariel Sharon, former Israeli prime minister, you can talk all you want about his true intentions, what he really meant. It was unilateral. It was messy. It was not. Nevertheless, it was a thread. It was something that we could have grabbed on and used as an opportunity to demonstrate what effective Palestinian self-governance looks like. And instead, we got Hamas and we got Gaza. That is not Hasbara. That is not Israeli propaganda. That is something that we should look inwardly and learn from as Palestinians so that we don't repeat this mistake.
Everything you just described is exactly why that first principle problem is important. Because your assumption, like mine, is that the desired solution is one form or the other of a 19th century a 19th century idea of self-determination, of a nation state, that a nation should have sovereignty over a region with territorial integrity. That is what's at question, right? This is what Zionism was about, and this is what the sort of Palestinian liberation, self-determination that you are representing is about. Self-rule under coherent territory around the identity of the nation, with the nation having the freedom to define itself and its culture and its political interests by itself. That is what self-rule is.
I would add just a major thing of like side by side next to a safe and a secure Israel. That is the only way to get both of our interests aligned, right? Let's say that you're, for the sake of this conversation, representing the Palestinian self-determination and I am representing Zionism. The only way those two ideas exist together is with self-determined territories side by side, respecting the security of the other, the borders of the other, without aggressively interfering in each other's self-rule, right? That is the philosophical idea underpinning the two-state solution. And I would add that that is the thread that has guided most views in Israel and under Zionism throughout history. There are other views. There is certainly smattering of religious zealots on the Israeli side that have an outsized power in our current government. And there's certainly other voices with varying views about Jewish self-determination throughout history from the Jewish community. But the main line of Zionism has always seen that as the priority, creating a space with territorial integrity where Jewish self-rule can take place without foreign interference. The priority is not imperial. The priority is certainly not genocidal. The priority is give us a territory that we can rule and call our own and leave us alone. That is the view that should Israelis and Palestinians both land on, a new horizon for the Middle East can be reached. But that therein lies the problem. The vision that you're describing describes fits the Zionist story. This is why Zionism was generally willing throughout history. The leaders of Zionism were generally willing to make territorial compromises, because if the goal is sovereignty, if the goal is the integrity of the territory and the self-rule, then making some compromises for that vision is acceptable. Whereas if this is not your goal, if self-sovereignty is not the goal of your leadership, if you're guided by something else, whether it is religious fanaticism or a different kind of imperialist view, like Nasser's pan-Arabism, then making compromises on territory is absurd. And I think this is one of the problems that we're having in having this conversation, not you and I, but the people who really do want to see a two-state or a two-nation solution, as you put it, and the people who pretend to, although some of them don't pretend anymore. And the problem is that there is an unwillingness to acknowledge that throughout history, there have been forces in the Middle East that have tried to play the Palestinian interest as a tool for other goals, be it Sunni Islamism or pan-Arabist, expansionist, anti-Western regional force, creating a coalition of anti-Western regional forces under some imperial rule or the other. And that shifted from Nasser's vision and then to Iran's vision. But the point is that in all these visions, the Palestinian interest, the Palestinian goal of self-determination was nothing but a ruse for the forces at play. I don't think there is going to be any progress in getting to a real future for actual Palestinians
for them to have safety and let alone self-rule, until that is reckoned with, not just in Palestinian society, as you've mentioned, where that conversation has not happened, not loudly, not publicly, where people are not asking publicly, why did Arafat betray us? Why did Arafat not take the deal when he had the option? Why did Mahmoud Abbas not take the deal when he was negotiating with Olmert? Why did we allow Hamas to squander that opportunity of truly being given sovereignty over our territory? Those conversations are not happening loudly, openly on the Palestinian side. But that will not be enough because, as you pointed out at the beginning, the voices, the people on the Palestinian side who are not truly interested in self-sovereignty, the Hamas leadership mainly, but some people in the Palestinian Authority as well, those people are currently being prepped up by Western powers who have developed an entire new vision about the region, which is a fantastical, almost zealously religious vision about decolonization and whatever fantasy projection they might have about their own colonial guilt that they're trying to resolve through the Middle East. Until those incoherences are resolved, or at least acknowledged, I don't think you're going to be able to get Israel to resurrect its old left. You're not going to get another Olmert offer until, again, not you, sadly the Palestinian people are not going to get another Olmert offer until they're convinced that they are not being duped again. From the Israeli perspective of all this, the narrative that you've described, the Arafat rejection, the Mahmoud Abbas rejection, and the takeover in Gaza and the second Intifada, I should throw it into it. All those events have, from the Israeli perspective, eliminated the Israeli left. They have eliminated.
And October 7th,
of course,
finished it off.
Right, but by at that point, the Israeli left was beginning to be a carcass. That's why Netanyahu was able to lead his very cynical divide and conquer policy between the West Bank and Gaza, right? He was only able to carry that strategy off because at that point, the Israeli left was becoming less and less effective in Israeli politics.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And that was because of 10, 15 years of signals from Palestinian leadership, not the Palestinian people, it's Palestinian leadership, that the vision that the left held about what kind of future we were trying to build together was a lie.
Mm-hmm.
And that every effort to reach that vision, that 19th century self-determination vision that guided Zionism and that the Zionists generally assumed guides Palestinian interests as well, is actually just an excuse to get another opportunity, another chance to destroy Zionism, to destroy the Jewish homeland. That this is just a time-stealing technique in order to get to the next front where an October 7th can be launched or a second Intifada can be launched.
Listen, it pains me to say this, and there are threads in what you said that I might state differently, but big picture, this is why I said this is uncomfortable for many Palestinians to hear, but there is no progress without winning over Israelis. You cannot rely on sanctioning Israel to death, thinking that somehow that's going to actually achieve any results. We have to win over Israelis. We have to, and that's beyond the tiny number of leftists that are, quite frankly, are irrelevant at this point. And this is where I don't know if Hamas is sophisticated enough where this was genuinely part of their strategy, genuinely part of their approach. But that is the ultimate. I don't think the rightward shift of Israeli society would be where it's at without the second Intifada and without Hamas. I genuinely don't think that. And so that is what
I would say. I do think that it is very much there. I think they are sophisticated. First of all, assuming that Hamas is not sophisticated is partly what got us to October 7th from the Israeli side. Hamas is very sophisticated, and the view of trying to radicalize your enemy and turning them into the monster your propaganda already portrays them as has been a piece of terrorist tactics for terrorist strategy, the terrorist game for 100 years. That's not even new to Hamas.
What I would say, though, is that it's not this like linear. It's like they understand, for example, that getting Israel in a place where Israel is killing a lot of civilians in Gaza,
right, exactly,
that is actually beneficial to them. But it's not so much like you can say it's sophisticated, but it's not this linear like Machiavellian, here's what we're thinking. It's kind of an amalgamation of different layers of this is how we're going to delegitimize Israel.
No, that's right. But all this depends on the goal to destabilize, if not entirely eliminate, ultimately Israel. And as opposed to if the goal were to develop a more sustainable future for the Palestinian people.
Precisely. But that's where this is where I have both immense, there's three channels, if you will, of emotions and thoughts and feelings that I have. One is immense anger and resentment at Hamas, at the leftists, at Western academia, and the kind of like this white Western savior model. But also, and now it's the white savior stuff. Before that, it was all the meddling of different players, the Islamists, the Pan-Arabists, the Islamic Republic of Iran right now. So there's that bucket. Then there's the bucket of desperation on my part to try to basically say what you and I just basically both said to each other, to fellow Palestinians, and have them actually listen and not have them immediately shut down, threaten to kill me, attack me, yell and scream back, say, engage in whataboutism, what about this, what about that? Just listen and sync with it. It's very uncomfortable to hear what you just said. There are elements of it, like I said, that somebody could scrutinize and say, well, Israel did this and Israel that. That's fine. That's okay. But the general threat, I and many other Palestinians quietly, I'm loud about it. I don't care. But many others will absolutely agree with. So there's a desperation to try to be like, guys, we're kind of approaching the point of no return. And then finally, out of the misery and the hope, the misery and the suffering in Gaza, there's a tranche of hope and optimism. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. And I do, just for the sake of time, want to transition to Iran a little bit after that. What do I mean by hope? I mean, believe me, I want to walk away from this discourse every single day. I worked in philanthropy and for an international NGO working in Africa and the global south, malaria, deworming, poverty alleviation, doing really incredible work, moving a lot of sums to life-saving and life-improving interventions. I miss my life in California. I miss my quiet life. I miss not being in this most unpleasant discourse, but I almost view it as a duty to do what I'm doing. I'm not doing it because I'm enjoying it. I'm doing it because it's a duty. However, what does sustain me is like the number of Arabs and Muslims and Palestinians that I told you regularly get in touch with me and are grateful and say, thank God someone else is saying what we know is true, but we have a hard time expressing. And also like the people in Gaza who believe this, there's a disconnect between what a lot of people in Gaza think versus what a lot of pro-Palestine people in the West and in Egypt and in Jordan and in North Africa. I don't care about the folks outside of when it comes to certain things. I could care less what someone in New York or London or Amman in Jordan think. I care more about the people in Gaza because those are the ones that are going to make the future. They agree with everything I'm saying, but they have a hard time saying it publicly for obvious reasons. So there's that thread. And then this is the key. If anything, I want people to leave from this conversation. It's that I don't believe after whatever ends up happening after the end of the war, however this war ends, and I have all sorts of theories about that, there will never be another, whether it's Hamas 2.0, Hamas 5.0, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, MISIS, everything you want. No one will ever again be able to brainwash people into this terror propaganda in the name of resistance. In Gaza, I'm talking, not the West Bank. West Bank is a whole different story. I actually think in a weird way, the war actually de-radicalized a lot of people because it made so many, even as they're furious with the Israeli military and the death and the destruction and the annihilation of their lives, they're 50 times as angry with Hamas serving them on a silver platter to the most far-right government in Israel's history. They're furious by Hamas's behavior, Hamas's statements, fighting amongst them in hospitals, in schools, in the displacement centers, stealing the aid. They see the fraud is all coming before that. They've seen Hezbollah collapse. The Assad is gone. The Islamic Republic of Iran is a paper tiger, despite the damage that it was able to. Largely speaking, Iran is a nothing burger. The Houthis, they just have a few dozen missiles that they're firing at Israel, but beyond that, there's nothing. They see Hamas spend billions of dollars on all these tunnels and all this, and Al Jazeera. Al Jazeera is the terror network of Hamas. Framed Hamas as like the Soviet Union, as this powerful, once claiming that Hamas almost destroyed 1,000 Israeli military vehicles. I mean, lies upon lies. They see all of that and they feel the rage. They feel duped. They're not stupid. They just, it's like, it hit them. It's like, oh my God, this has been a 30 to 40 year fraud. These Islamists, terrorists, Muslim Brotherhood, Sunnis, but in alliance with the scummiest of the Shia fundamentalists, aka the Islamic Republic of Iran, aka the mullahs regime. No one is ever going to be able to reproduce the armed resistance narrative in Gaza and reincarnate the Hamas narrative. That doesn't mean they're all about to be Zionist or they're all pro-Israel, or that this in and of itself will lead to a linear clarity on what needs to be done to engage in nation building. So there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. And it's not just due to the consequences of the war on October 7th. It's that it is partially due to the consequences, but more importantly, it's Hamas's behavior and the whole house of cards just crumbling. So that's where I actually have hope that after this war, de-Hamasification is actually going to be very possible. I genuinely think that we can get to a place after this war where Hamas will be like the Ba'athist Party, like the Nazi Party, like the Stalinists, like they will actually be outlawed, even if they're reduced to an idea. I don't care that they're still an idea. I'm talking about them as a cohesive political entity. I don't believe for a second that Hamas is going to be able to maintain any leverage of power, even if there's a temporary ceasefire hostage deal. I think the Palestinians, if they're given a real chance, will chase these SOBs with their bare shoes to the end of the Gaza and will grab them and hang them. Mark my words, you will see some of that happen. It might be months from now, it might be a year from now, but I genuinely think we will witness some dramatic scenes of mass executions of Hamas members. And again, that's not going to usher in a new democratic era. There could still be chaos and horror. But Hamas's era is going to come to an end. And what I'm desperately trying to do is to actually start preparing for some seeds for what follows.
First of all, I hope you're right, because in and of itself, Hamas has been a malignant force for Palestinians, first and foremost, and for the region in general. And I, for one, am fascinated to see. I look forward to seeing the faces of Westerners watching these scenes should they unfold, not understanding how could Palestinians be killing Hamas? Isn't Hamas the Palestinian savior after all? That will be fascinating to watch. However, as you were pointing out, that does not translate into accepting or even tolerating Zionism. And part of the problem, as I've stated at the beginning, is that if you have a culture that is fundamentally rejecting your neighbor, and of course now it's going to be even more difficult after the war and the horrific scenes that were caused through it. We can discuss whether war crimes were committed, and I'm sure, as in every war, you can point to events and say that these were, in fact, war crimes by any international standard. But even if there weren't, it doesn't matter. It doesn't alleviate any of the immediate horrific death toll and infrastructure harm and the destruction that has left Gaza in rubble, right? So sentiment towards Israelis certainly has not improved as a result of October 7th. And if there is a reversion to defining the Palestinian identity around some form of resistance to Zionism itself, to Jewish self-determination, it might not be Hamas, but another force with equal zealotry could come in and fill the void.
I mean, that concerns me, but I also I also will tell you,
and I should also add that I'm also terrified. You say that people come to you and agree with you quietly. I am terrified that even if the floodgates finally do open and Palestinians come out openly, not just criticizing Hamas, but saying, okay, we are ready. It was a mistake to reject Zionism. We don't love you. We might never be able to love each other, but we need to be able to figure out a pragmatic plan to living together. That by the time that this happens, it might be too late on the Israeli side, given political trends.
What I will say, though, is that I don't know that you need Gazans to love or even accept or embrace Zionism as it might not happen for a couple of generations. And that should, I actually think in a sense that might be fine, because what you need is for Gazans to realize that this is Gaza's borders. Gaza is no longer ever going to be a platform for any violent acts or resistance or terrorism against Israel. There will be consequences to our actions, consequences that no amount of death and destruction or imagery by Al Jazeera and international press are going to shield you from. There needs to be a focus on nation building to turn Gaza into a compelling role model for what effective Palestinian self-governance. That's my whole ethos. What does effective Palestinian self-governance look like beyond blaming Israel for all of our ills? You want sovereignty? You want Israel to loosen the blockade? Well, you can't actually, the blockade was a result of Hamas announcing its intention to attack Israel, to smuggle weapons, building rockets and tunnels and all of that infrastructure, with October 7th ultimately proving Israel right, that Hamas was always interested in this ultimate goal. And so, all of that work, internal work to build Gaza, to focus on nation building, to focus on what does Palestinian sovereignty look like, that can, as long as there's a clear understanding that there is to be no violence towards Israel and the kibbutzim, and that there needs to be a serious accountability on anyone taking actions on behalf of the Palestinian people in Gaza, then you don't really need buy-in to, at least initially, or for a generation or two, Like, people need to experience life under optimal conditions to realize that this is what peace with Israel looks like.
My point is that I don't expect anybody to give a rat's ass about Zionism's vision. However, it has been a core component of Palestinian political leadership to see the destruction of Zionism as a goal and a rallying cry. That has to be overcome.
And that could and will change, I think, with the younger generations who there's a common thread among younger generations worldwide now with cell phone technologies and social media, and like Iranian young people, Syrian young people, Lebanese, Egyptians, others, some of them might have problematic views, but at the end of the day, everybody wants a job. Everybody wants to get married. Everybody wants a family. Everybody wants a car. Everybody wants an iPhone. Everybody wants nice clothes. Like, both the acquisition of safety, the acquisition of materials, and the ability to move around freely, I think those are capable of de-radicalizing younger people, especially because in Gaza, so far, you don't have the crazy, I mean, you may have radicalization in the form of previous generations with the educational system. But there is an opportunity to reformulate the educational system so that it's one about development that's going to be tied to the reconstruction. Whoever reconstructs Gaza, whether it be the Gulf nations or the international community or the business community, and I've been a part of some of these conversations, no one is going to just deliver handouts per the previous wars. No. People want to, there's almost like a new covenant that is going to be drawn with Gaza. And part of that is the orientation about you can have your own private views, but you need to understand that this whole building generations for armed resistance, this idea that Israel is this transitory body that you're just going to dedicate generation after generation to basically eliminating, that we're not paying for that. We're not going to be a part of that. We're not going to facilitate that. You cannot pursue that and expect us to help you rebuild your nation. And I genuinely think that if that is in fact implemented with some kind of a bringing down of the heat and the temperature in the West Bank, because Al Jazeera, and also if we want to de-radicalize, I don't know how we de-radicalize people with Al Jazeera still around. Like that's the, and a major non-NATO ally where our biggest base is based, Air Force base and intelligence collection. Like, that's the other thing is, okay, so we're going to rebuild Gaza, and have, but it takes one incident in the West Bank for Al Jazeera to just spin into, the Zionists and the occupation is continuing and blah, blah, blah. And so separating Gaza from the West Bank is going to be partially necessary. But I don't know how, I keep telling people, what's happening in the West Bank is radically different than what's happening in Gaza. And we should not in Gaza be shooting rockets at Israel because somehow that's going to help Jerusalem. You can't destroy Gaza and just slap the word Aqsa, which is the word for the mosque in Jerusalem. You can't just destroy Gaza and slap the word Aqsa and think that that's somehow, okay, everything is sababa, everything is Gucci. So I still maintain that Gaza overlooking the Mediterranean, I have a plan. I don't know if you can see it here actually, but, there's a glare, but I want to build an artificial peninsula using all the rubble. It's called Rubbles to Runways. I want to take all the rubble and build an artificial peninsula and put an airfield and a small seaport on it, bring in power ships, power generation ships, medical hospital, like a hospital ship, grain ships, moving people in and out. Like, I think with all the different development opportunities, freedom of movement, overlooking the Mediterranean, Gaza hasn't had a functional seaport for 50 years. 50 years, man. The only territory, the only piece of land, of property overlooking the Mediterranean that doesn't have a seaport. So the potential is immense. And I think if that's presented to the population there will come. One more thing, by the way, I have seen so many Gazans throughout the war who express, because I have friends in the West Bank who are upset with other West Bankers who are kind of moving on with their lives, carrying on with their lives. There's the big mall in Ramallah. People are, like, people don't, it's like, okay, yeah, Gaza's like this on-off switch that they turn. And so people in Gaza, they don't want to be cannon fodder for folks in the West Bank. There's like cultural and geographic separation between the two. So I've seen enough Gazans say, like, no, like, we want to have a statelet almost in Gaza. So I really am optimistic. I really genuinely think that the future ahead for Gaza, assuming we can significantly weaken Hamas to where what remains of them is something that the Palestinian people in Gaza can go after, I think the potentiality for transformation is there.
I hope so. I think, as I said, to avoid repeating myself, I'll just summarize that. I think it all depends on what you said at the beginning, that we can reach a point where the function is clear, or the equation is clear, that the rebuilding, that the growth, that the prosperity is contingent on foregoing the exterminist fantasies and the idea that you're just here to wait out the destruction of your neighbors.
Mm-hmm.
Because the visions like an open port and free movement and entry of goods will be disrupted every time that there's another threat to destroy Israel.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So getting that across, getting that paradigm shift to be rendered throughout Gaza will be the true achievement. I hope that it is possible, because I would love to see a world where Israel and Gazans live as neighbors, maybe still uncomfortable neighbors, but where it's not a story of constant conflagration and self-destruction year after year. It will be wonderful.
Absolutely.
I pray for that.
Inshallah, within our lifetime.
Yeah. Any thoughts on Iran before we're done? I don't know if there's much to say, but
well, I'll just broadly speaking say that the Iranian people are incredibly intelligent, hardworking, beautiful people with a long and amazing history. They deserve better leadership than the trash that exists in Tehran. They deserve better economic and social prospects than the fundamentalist Islamist regime that exists there. And I am all for empowering them to achieve their own self-determination against a fascistic regime. I will say that I am also able to compartmentalize enough to where I may despise Netanyahu to the moon and back. And after 2 decades now of seeing the Islamic Republic of Iran building a clearly non-civilian nuclear program that is meant to ultimately produce nuclear weapons, that is meant to be a tool for the regime's survival, I am extraordinarily opposed to any attempt to normalize the this fascist Nazi regime having nuclear weapons and nuclear technology. And so would I have liked to see this achieved through diplomatic means? Certainly. Did I, for a second, think that the Trump administration is even remotely capable of striking a halfway meaningful deal? No. You don't have, and that's not to say that the JCPOA, as much as I did think it was the closest thing we had to a viable framework, that's not to say that the Obama reached agreement was transformative either. It did nevertheless allow for Iran, allow for some hamstringing and clipping of Iran's ability to expand its nuclear program. So it's like it's been really challenging to channel those sentiments because everything has just become so black and white. Trump versus non-Trump, Netanyahu versus not Netanyahu, warmonger hawk versus, peace dove, or just a stupid, ignorant leftist Democrat who has no idea how security or nuclear anything works. Isolationist right or the anti-war left. So, but I absolutely support military actions that I wished would have been led by a coalition of nations against specific targets, military targets of the Islamic Republic. I am unapologetic about that. Unapologetic. Because I look at my beautiful Gaza and it is in ruins because of the Islamic Republic of Iran. It is in ruins because of Hamas being part of the so-called axis of resistance. I look at 4 Arab countries, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen, that were occupied by the Islamic Republic of Iran. Hundreds of thousands directly and millions of Arab peoples perished over the past 2 decades because of actions by the Islamic Republic of Iran. This is an evil in the region that must be confronted. I am tired of having to play diplomatic games and being under the mercy of this entity that, like I said, there will never be a prosperous Palestinian state, a safe and secure Palestinian state with the Islamic Republic of Iran existing in its current shape and format. And by the way, I've spoken to Palestinian, American, and Israeli officials about the crap that Iran does on a daily basis. I should say did, because maybe that is being compromised right now. In the West Bank, that the plots that are being foiled, the millions of dollars they've been pumping into the West Bank, into armed groups, into terrorists, into random cells, into incitement. What happened in Jenin and Tulkarm and Tubas and northern West Bank, that got 40,000 Palestinians displaced because of a bunch of guys with AK-47s and M16s wanting to do resistance. And they were all supported and sponsored by Hamas, by Iran, including some Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad. They were 100% paid for by the Islamic Republic of Iran, hoping that this would lead to a third intifada in the West Bank. And so Iran is a deadly menace, and they have to be confronted. And it is most unfortunate that the ones doing the confronting right now, for a variety of reasons, is Benjamin Netanyahu. Like I said, someone whom I consider a war criminal and someone whom I personally despise. But such is international relations that is so complex in today's interconnected world, and you have to be savvy enough to compartmentalize emotions, to compartmentalize all the different moving parts of a region like the Middle East. I mean, after all, we're talking about Syria being led by Ahmed al-Shara, formerly known as Julani, who was the head of Al-Qaeda in Syria. And he met with the U.S. president. And so things are constantly shifting and changing in this region. And I pray for the safety of the Iranian people, the civilians, and certainly the safety of Israeli people and Palestinian civilians who are impacted and hit and wounded by Iranian and Yemeni missiles coming in supposedly as a form of resistance and retaliation. But just like in October, the sole person who was killed last October when Iran launched a missile at Israel was a Palestinian who in the West Bank who was hit by a falling missile.
I just want to give you a lightning round question. What do you recognize as the blind spot on the left and the blind spot on the right?
Blind spot on the right is that there's just no recognition of, oftentimes, there's no recognition of humanity of Palestinians and Arab peoples, particularly Palestinians. They had it coming. They deserve it. They're all Hamas. There's just a gross generalization and almost like a jingoistic hoorah, get them all. And I just think that often crosses into very inhumane territory that also clouds judgment and the ability to engage in analysis and to actually read things and to pull out different threads of information. On the left, I think the clouding, the judgment, like what they often miss is that, if I may be honest, and I swear I don't mean this as like a personal insult, but there's a lack of sophistication, honestly, on the part of a lot of leftists. There's a lack of kind of like this realpolitik, understanding how the world actually works, understanding how the Middle East works, understanding that the world is not an ideological playing field. The world is a messy, complex place where there's a cacophony of interests and voices and noise. And to really understand that, you have to and do so in a compassionate, principled manner is difficult, because I consider myself compassionate and principled, and yet you have to actually sometimes get either at best, like really understand messy situations and put yourself outside the frameworks that you normally have trained yourself in leftist la lands. At worst, you have to accept that this is how the world operates. And I see so many missed opportunities for leftists to be helpful influencers for policy, because a lot of younger people tend to lean left. A lot of people tend to start from a leftist orientation because it's compassionate. It proclaims to be understanding, to care about all people, and have really nice sounding and potentially sincere ideology behind it, but it often clashes with the reality of the harsh realities of the world.
Ahmed, we are entering a new phase in the Middle East with the war in Iran, the war in Gaza. We're clearly entering something new, or at least a new phase. I really hope that your vision will be a beacon that at least directionally charts the path to where we're headed, and that our shared understanding of what the Middle East can be will find a way to be, or at least to start being realized. Who knows? Thank you, Ahmed.
Inshallah. Thank you, brother. Thanks for having me, Adam.
Thank you for listening to Uncertain Things. Follow us on uncertain.substack.com or wherever you get your podcasts. If you're feeling generous, give us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts and share us with your friends and enemies. Until next time, stay sane.